restaurant my future mother-in-law chose for the rehearsal dinner was the kind of place where the menus have no prices. Café Laurent, tucked into a side street in the Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta, all cream linen and low candlelight, and servers who materialize and disappear without a sound. I remember thinking, as I smoothed my dress in the cab on the way over, that this was exactly the kind of restaurant where you weren't supposed to talk about anything real. I was 31. I'd spent the last 6 years building a financial planning practice from a desk in my apartment into a firm with 4 advisors and a real lease in Midtown. My name was on the door. Literally, frosted glass. Avery Sinclair Financial Group. I bought my own condo at 28. I drove a car I paid for in cash. I'm telling you this not to brag, but because it matters. It matters for what came next. My fiancé, who I'll call my fiancé because that's what he was for, exactly 6 more hours that evening, was a corporate attorney, charming in that specific way that reads as warmth until you realize it's actually very precise social management. We'd met at a charity gala, dated for 2 years, gotten engaged 6 months before the rehearsal dinner. His family was old Atlanta money, the kind that has a neighborhood named after something they once owned, the kind that sends flowers to your office when they hear good news about your business, but in a way that always feels slightly like surveillance. His older brother was the one who spoke first. We were on the second course, a butternut squash bisque I couldn't taste because my jaw was too tight. When my future brother-in-law set down his spoon and said he wanted to make a small toast, the table went quiet. There were 14 of us, his parents at the heads. My 2 closest friends from college sitting across from me looking politely attentive. My fiancé's hand resting near mine on the tablecloth, but not touching it. His brother stood. He was 40, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who takes up space as a default rather than an effort. He smiled at me, and the smile was warm, and I felt myself relax slightly, and then he started talking. He said how wonderful it was that the family was growing, how much they all admired my drive and my ambition. Those exact words, drive and ambition, both delivered with the faintest suggestion of quotation marks around them, like traits that required context. He said that my fiancé had spoken so highly of my business acumen. He paused there, let it land. Then he said that, of course, when 2 families join together, there are certain expectations about how things are structured, that in their family, the wives manage the household finances. Not their own professional finances, he clarified with a generous nod, just the household accounts, the bill paying, the scheduling. His mother had done it for 40 years. His own wife had taken it on happily. It was how the family stayed coordinated. He paused again. He looked at me. And then he said he looked forward to Avery taking on that coordination role for all of them, not just our household, all of them, his parents' accounts too, the family foundation calendar, the household staff scheduling for the main house. I counted to 3 inside my own head. I heard my best friend across the table make a sound that she immediately converted into a cough. I said, very pleasantly, that I had 2 quick questions. His brother looked surprised, but nodded. I said, when you say the household coordination role, are we talking about my household and my fiancé's family's household, or just ours? He said, oh, the whole extended family, really. That's how it works. I said, and what is my fiancé's coordination role in this structure? Silence. The specific silence of 14 people suddenly finding their water glasses. Very interesting. My fiancé said my name, just my name, in the tone I recognized from arguments we'd had before. The tone that meant I was embarrassing him by treating something as an actual conversation. His brother said something about tradition, about how the men in their family handled the financial strategy, while the women managed the day-to-day. He said it was a partnership. I asked who was currently managing the day-to-day coordination for his parents' household. He said they had a part-time assistant, but that with a daughter-in-law joining the family, it made more sense to consolidate. I looked at my fiancé. He was looking at the tablecloth. I said, thank you for explaining, and I picked up my clutch, excused myself to the restroom, and texted my best friend 4 words, do not leave yet. I did not go to the restroom. I went to the small coat room off the entrance hallway, and I sat on a bench between 2 wool coats, and I called my college roommate, who is now an estate attorney in Dallas, and I said, I need you to think out loud with me about something. She said, okay. I told her what had just happened, word for word, including the part about the family assistant being replaced by me. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Avery, do you have a prenuptial agreement? We didn't. My fiancé had raised it once, early on, and I'd actually been the one who said I didn't think we needed it. I'd been too proud to seem like I was protecting assets in a relationship I believed in. I told my roommate this. She said, "Okay, that's fine, but I want you to go back in there and ask him one more question before the evening ends." She told me what to ask. I went back to the table. My fiancé watched me sit down with a look of visible relief that I read as, "She's going to let this go." I waited until there was a natural pause in the conversation. Then I said, "I want to circle back to what you were describing." I looked at my future brother-in-law and I said, "The coordination role. Does that include managing the disbursements from the family trust accounts?" The shift in the room was so fast it felt physical. My future father-in-law set down his fork. My future brother-in-law's expression went from patronizing warmth to something harder in about a second and a half. My fiancé said my name again, differently this time. His brother said, "That's not really relevant to this conversation." I said, "Oh, I only ask because if I'm coordinating the family's financial logistics, I'd want to understand the full scope of what I'd be working with. Knowing the structure of the trust account seems important. Don't you think?" Nobody answered. I excused myself again. This time I got my coat. My best friend was beside me at the coat check inside of 90 seconds. She didn't ask any questions until we were in the Uber. Then she said, "What was that about the trust accounts?" I said, "I don't know yet, but something is wrong." My fiancé called 7 times before I reached my condo. I didn't answer. My roommate called once and I answered immediately. She said she'd been doing some quick research and she wanted to ask me something about the condo I owned, the one I'd purchased 2 years before I met my fiancé. I said it was in my name alone. She said, "Good. What about the joint savings account you'd mentioned opening?" We had opened one 8 months prior. It was meant for wedding expenses and initial house hunting funds. We'd each deposited $10,000 into it. She said, "Okay, I want you to log into that account tonight and take a screenshot of every transaction." I asked why. She said, "Because the conversation you just described at that dinner table was not about household coordination, it was about positioning. And people who think in terms of positioning usually have already positioned some things." I logged in at midnight. The joint account showed 3 transfers I had not been told about. Each one was labeled family investment, and each one had gone to the same external account. Total, $8,400. Over 5 months, all initiated from his login. I did not feel angry right away. I felt the particular clarity that comes when something you half suspected becomes confirmed. Like the moment an X-ray shows exactly what you'd been afraid to find. I texted my roommate the screenshots. She called me back in 3 minutes. She said, "I want you to understand what I'm looking at. This may be nothing. Family loan, legitimate expense he forgot to mention. It may be something. Either way, you deserve to know before you sign a marriage license. Because after that, his financial decisions are legally entangled with yours in ways that will be much harder to unpick." She said she was going to make some calls in the morning. My fiancé showed up at my building at 7 a.m. He had a coffee from the place we always went. He said he knew I was upset, and that his brother had been tone-deaf, and that the family could be old-fashioned. He said the coordination thing was more of a suggestion than a requirement. He said his family really loved me, and that this was all going to be fine. I asked him about the transfers from the joint account. His face did something complicated. He said it was a loan to his brother, a short-term thing. His brother had had some cash flow issues with a real estate investment and had asked for help, and my fiancé had just moved the money without thinking, because it was his brother, and they helped each other. I asked if he'd intended to tell me. He said of course, he'd just kept forgetting. I said, $8,400 across 5 months, and you kept forgetting. He said I was making this into something it wasn't. I said, "Let me ask you something directly. The family trust. Your parents' estate planning. Are you a trustee?" He looked at the window. He said yes, that he and his brother were co-trustees. I said, "Are you expecting me to be involved in administering that trust?" He said, "Only in a support role." I said, "My name isn't on any trust documents, is it?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. I said, "Your brother asked me to manage your family's financial logistics. You're a co-trustee of your parents' estate. You moved money from our joint account to your brother without telling me. I need you to help me understand how these three things are connected. He stood up. He said I was being paranoid and transactional, and that I had a problem with intimacy that I'd always had, that I couldn't just let people in without turning everything into a negotiation. He said his family was trying to welcome me and I was treating it like a hostile takeover. I asked him to leave my condo and return my key. He told me I was making a huge mistake. I said, "The key, please." He left it on the counter. The door closing behind him sounded so much louder than it should have for how small the moment was. My roommate flew in from Dallas 2 days later. She didn't need to. We could have done everything over the phone and email, but she came anyway, which is the kind of thing you remember. We sat at my kitchen island with my laptop open and a pot of coffee between us, and she walked me through what she'd found. The joint account transfers had gone to an LLC registered in his brother's name. The LLC had a single filing, a purchase contract on a small commercial property in Smyrna. The purchase had fallen through. The money was still sitting in the LLC account. She said this wasn't necessarily fraud, but it was money moved without my knowledge or consent from a shared account into a separate entity, and any reasonable court would view that as a problem. She had also, through her network, found out something about the family trust. She said, "Their parents' estate planning attorney is someone your fiancé's father has worked with for 30 years. That's not unusual, but the trust has what's called a family advisor clause, which basically means a designated family member can be appointed to review and advise on disbursements on behalf of the beneficiaries. That role has been held by the brother's wife for 12 years. She said, "I think what happened at that dinner was not a welcome speech. I think it was a transfer of duties. They wanted you in that role because you have an actual financial background, which would make you useful to them, and because once you were embedded in the trust administration, it would be very difficult for you to take any position that conflicted with the family's financial interests without it looking like a conflict of your own." I sat with that for a long time. She said, "You didn't sign anything. You don't owe them anything. The question is just what you want to do now." I said, "I want the money back from the joint account, and I want to know if there's anything else I don't know." She said, "Then let's find out." We spent the next 4 days pulling every thread. My roommate contacted a colleague in Atlanta who specialized in financial litigation. Together they sent a formal letter to my fiancé and his family's attorney requesting a full accounting of the joint account transfers and a written clarification of any expected roles or responsibilities in any existing family trust or estate instrument, along with written confirmation that no documents had been signed on my behalf or would be requested. The letter was professional and specific, and it landed like a grenade. His brother called me directly, which told me the attorney had gotten straight to the family before responding professionally. He said the letter was insulting. He said his family had welcomed me, and this was how I responded. He said if I was going to be this adversarial, maybe the wedding needed to be reconsidered. I said, "I think that might be right." He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "You understand what you're walking away from." I said, "I understand exactly what I'm walking away from. I'm less sure you understand what you are walking me toward." My fiancé came over that evening. He looked like he hadn't slept. He sat across from me in my living room, and he said his brother had overreacted and the letter had been unnecessary, and we could fix this. He said we loved each other. He said the family stuff was just noise, just old patterns, and that none of it would actually affect our life together. I said, "You moved $8,000 out of our joint account without telling me, and you didn't mention it for 5 months. Is that an old pattern?" He said he didn't think of it as our money yet, that we weren't married. I said, "Then why did we open a joint account?" He didn't have an answer that held. I said, "I need to ask you something honestly, and I need an honest answer. Did you know, when your brother gave that speech at the rehearsal dinner, what the actual purpose of that speech was?" He looked at the floor. He said he'd known his brother was going to say something about family roles. He'd thought it would be briefer. He'd thought I would understand it as a gesture. I said, "You knew." He said, "I thought you'd just..." He stopped. He tried again. "I thought you could just..." He stopped again. I said, "You thought I would just go along with it?" He didn't say yes. He didn't have to. There's a particular kind of grief that arrives before you've officially lost something. I felt it then, sitting across from a man I had genuinely loved, watching him be unable to say the true thing. The true thing was that he had loved a version of me that was accomplished and self-sufficient and impressive, and he'd also simultaneously expected me to quietly absorb his family's expectations, and he'd never identified the contradiction in those two things because he'd never had to. No one had ever made him. I said, "I'll return the engagement ring this week. I'd like the joint account dispersed equally and closed within 10 days. My attorney will confirm the amounts." He said, "You're really doing this?" I said, "You're really doing this?" I said, "Yes." He left. I sat in my living room for a while with the lights on and the engagement ring on the coffee table, and I felt, beneath the grief, something that I can only describe as solid ground. Like I had been walking on something that looked stable and had just stepped back onto something that actually was. The response from the family's attorney arrived 4 days later. The money was returned in full. The attorney's letter was carefully worded in ways that said nothing while implying regret. There was no acknowledgement of anything improper. There didn't need to be. The return of the money was the acknowledgement. My own fiancé's mother sent a note on actual stationery. It said she hoped I would reconsider. It said the family had only wanted the best for me. It said they would be willing to revisit certain expectations. I read it twice. I didn't respond. My roommate said not responding was the correct call, that any response would be treated as an opening, and she was right. The hardest part was telling people. Not my close friends, they knew the shape of it already. The hard part was the wider circle. The people I'd already sent, save the dates to. The colleagues who'd asked me about the wedding over coffee. There is a specific social weight to a broken engagement. A particular way people's faces shift, something between sympathy and uncomfortable curiosity, as though they're trying to figure out which part of the story they're supposed to find reassuring. I told it plainly. I said we had discovered some significant incompatibilities in our financial values and our expectations about autonomy. Most people accepted this. Some pushed for more detail. I gave them a little more, that I'd learned some important things about how his family operated, and had decided the partnership wasn't what I thought it was. That was usually enough. What surprised me was how many women, specifically, said something like, "I understand more than you know," or "Good for you for seeing it before," or "I didn't, and I wish I had." Not dramatically, not in a way that demanded more conversation, just a quiet acknowledgement that this particular situation was not as uncommon as the rehearsal dinner setting had made it feel. That response, the quiet, private recognition from women who had been in versions of this situation, stayed with me through the months that followed. Through the awkward period of separating my life from the plans we'd made, through the quiet of evenings in my condo with no ring on my finger and no wedding to plan, I started thinking about what I actually knew about how people navigated money in new relationships. As a financial planner, I spent my days helping clients think through investment strategies and retirement accounts and tax efficiency. I rarely had conversations with clients about what happened when financial expectations in a partnership were misaligned, about the specific practical ways that financial control could be mistaken for love or support or tradition, about the kind of structural arrangements that could trap someone long before they recognized the trap. I started having those conversations, informally at first, with clients who asked, with friends who needed it, with the occasional stranger at a conference who had a look I was starting to recognize. And I started building out a framework, a series of questions that anyone entering a serious partnership could work through before the stakes of a marriage license made the answers legally binding. My roommate called it pre-partnership financial literacy and said I should probably charge for it. My best friend called it the checklist and said I should put it somewhere people could actually find it. I rebuilt my practice around it. Not entirely. I still have clients with portfolios and retirement projections and the regular work of a financial planning firm. But I added a service line specifically focused on financial transparency in new partnerships, on how to have the real conversations before the ring, before the joint account, before the family dinner where someone's brother stands up and tells you what your role is going to be. I won't pretend the ending of my engagement wasn't painful. It was. Grief doesn't negotiate with logic. I had loved who I thought he was, and losing that, even knowing what I knew, was a real loss. I let myself feel that, but I also started to understand something I hadn't fully articulated before that rehearsal dinner. The table had been set for me long before I arrived. The expectations had been drafted before anyone asked whether I'd agree to them, and the most dangerous part wasn't the brother's speech, or the transfers, or the trust structure. The most dangerous part was that I'd walked into that restaurant already halfway to accepting things I hadn't examined, because I trusted the relationship, and I trusted the version of my fiancé that I'd been presented with, and I hadn't asked enough of the right questions early enough. I ask them now, for myself and for anyone who will let me help them ask. Last spring, I spoke at a women's financial wellness conference in Charlotte, 400 people in a convention hall. My session was titled, What the Prenup Conversation is Actually About. I opened it by telling the story of the rehearsal dinner. Not all of it. Not the private details, just the shape of it. The speech. My 2 questions. The silence. I said, the reason those 2 questions mattered wasn't that they were confrontational. They mattered because they required someone else to say out loud what they'd only been willing to imply. And when people are forced to say out loud what they've only been willing to imply, you find out very quickly whether the thing they were implying is something you can live with. The room was very quiet. I said, you are allowed to ask what the rules are. You are allowed to ask what your partner's role is. You are allowed to treat clarity as an act of love rather than an act of suspicion. The people who tell you that asking questions is unromantic or transactional are usually the people who benefit from you not asking. After the session, a woman waited until most of the room had cleared. She looked to be in her late 20s. She said she'd gotten engaged 4 months ago, and that there had been a dinner, and that during the dinner, her fiancé's family had said some things she hadn't known how to respond to, and that she'd been telling herself ever since that she was probably overreacting. I said, what things? She told me. They weren't identical to my situation, they were close enough. I gave her my card. I said, you're not overreacting, come talk to me. She did. She came to my office 2 weeks later with her own financial documents and a list of questions she'd written out on a legal pad, careful and earnest, and trying to be fair to everyone including herself. We went through everything, what she owned, what the expectations had been, what she hadn't yet asked. She asked those questions. I don't know all of what happened after. She sent me a message a few months later that just said, I figured out what I needed to know. Thank you. That's usually how it goes. People figure out what they need to know and then they make their own choices. My job is just to make sure the questions get asked before the answers are too expensive. The condo is still mine. The business is still growing. I bought a new plant for my office window, which sounds small but felt significant. The deliberate act of adding something alive to a space that is entirely my own. My name is on the door. Just my name. That was always the part I got right. I've thought a lot about what would have happened if I'd stayed quiet at that table. It's not a hypothetical I dwell on with regret. It's one I return to because it clarifies something I think is worth saying out loud. If I had sat there and nodded, if I had taken my future brother-in-law's speech as the awkward but ultimately harmless thing my fiancé later called it, I would have walked into a marriage carrying a set of expectations I had never agreed to, and because I hadn't agreed to them out loud, there would have been no clear moment to object to them later. That's how it works, not through force, but through assumption. You don't get handed a contract, you just gradually become someone who honors one. What I know now, what that rehearsal dinner taught me in the span of about 45 seconds, is that clarity is not the enemy of love. The people who told me I was being transactional, that I was turning a warm family gesture into a negotiation, were counting on that framing, because the alternative framing, the accurate one, was that they had already decided what I would be doing with my time and my skills and my professional knowledge, and they had simply chosen a champagne toast as the vehicle for informing me. Calling my questions transactional was a way of making my self-respect sound like a character flaw. Avery, and I mean me, the version of me sitting in that coat room on a bench between 2 wool coats calling my roommate, had enough left of herself to recognize that. Not because I was unusually brave, because I had built something real and I knew what it felt like to own a thing outright, and I knew the difference between being welcomed into a family and being recruited into one. The money mattered. I want to be honest about that. The $8,000 moved without my knowledge, the trust structure I hadn't been told about. Those things mattered practically, and they mattered as information. They told me something about the pattern I was stepping into. But what mattered more was the simpler thing underneath all of it, that the man I had chosen to marry had known what his brother was going to say, and had said nothing to prepare me, and had then asked me, in the middle of my own humiliation, to just enjoy the party. That's the thing that required a decision. I think about the woman who came to find me after the conference in Charlotte. The one with the legal pad and the careful questions and the quiet certainty that she was probably overreacting. She wasn't overreacting. She was paying attention. And paying attention is not the same as being suspicious or unloving or transactional. It is in fact one of the most loving things you can do for yourself and for the relationship you're trying to build. Because a partnership that can't survive honest questions was never going to survive the harder things that come later. What I walked away from that rehearsal dinner with wasn't just my financial independence intact. It was the knowledge that I could hold my own ground in a room full of people who expected me not to. That's not a small thing. That is, I'd argue, the whole thing. The condo is still mine. The name on the door is still mine. I bought a plant for my office window this past spring, and I water it every Monday morning before my first client call. It sounds like a small detail. It is a small detail. But so is a key left on a counter. So is a question asked at a dinner table. So is the click of a door closing behind someone who finally told you the truth about what they thought you were worth. The small things are where you find out. Pay attention to the small things.